Thank you very much, Sunil. Thank you all for coming, and it's indeed a pleasure and a privilege, really, to be, for Studio Abhyas, to be launching The Roots of Yoga, which has been co-authored by James Mallinson and Mark Singleton. So before we start, without much ado, I'd like to introduce the book. So can you please hold this up? And this is the book. It's a penguin. Touch it. Yeah. A penguin has a table outside where you can look at the book and maybe order it. This is a very interesting mix that we're looking at right now in front of us, James and Mark. And the mix, I hope I'll talk a little bit about it, because it's a very unlikely combination of these two people coming together. And when I met them and I was talking to them, and I said, it's a very volatile combination. And I'll tell you why it's volatile. I have Mark on my left. Mark's book, Yoga Body, which some of you have seen or read. I read that book in one go, in like one night. And it's maybe the only other book I've ever read in one night is the Vikram Seth, not the Suitable Boy, the Bridge, the Golden Gate, and for reasons of my own. But the reason that I couldn't put Mark's book down was because, being a Bharatanatyam dancer, when I read Mark's book on the reconstruction of yoga over the last 100 years, I was stunned to see the similarities. Not the similarities, it was a ditto history of what dance went through in the 20th century, of how it was. The history of dance is fabricated, it is falsified, it is imagined beyond belief, appropriated, and suddenly presented to the world as this grand, seamless, ageless, pure, moral, spiritual Indian culture. Similarly, yoga history went through the same thing, and it's a history that's less known than the dance history today, because I think the yoga history started happening a little later than the dance history. So Mark focuses on modern yoga, which happened in the last 100 years or even less, and which focuses on yoga being postural yoga. So this whole thing of presenting to the world this physical exercise regime of postural yoga, asana, so to speak, is what Mark has worked on. So it is very much within the post-colonial realm that Mark's discourse stands. James, on the other hand, on the other side, talks not of history but of practice. But practice, I mean, he's an ordained mahant, so he's actually living with the sadhu, so to speak. So he's talking of not just practice, but very highly specialized practice, especially the Khechari Vidya, which is a tantric practice. It is a practice that was shunned by the modernists, like Vivekananda, who said, shun tantra, shun hatha yoga, because it is, as he famously said, it weakens the brain. Literally, he said, this is a thing I remember from Mark's book. So there are these people. So he talks of practice and the nitty-gritty of practice, and a practice with no holds barred experimentation with the body. Whereas Mark's realm was the idea of yoga, so this is nitty-gritty of the body, no hold bars body, and this is a very censored, very sanitized version of postural yoga. And historically, the two realms, so he is, for me, a pre-colonial realm, and he is a post-colonial realm, and these two realms don't really talk to each other. In fact, they're sitting with their backs towards each other, as far as I'm concerned. There's a very determined kind of an agenda to keep things separate. So to see these two guys steering a shift is really gallant, really, because they are steering very important, very significant shifts. And I won't name many shifts, but a couple of them. They are shifting the focus from idea of yoga or the philosophy of yoga, because they are statedly staying away from philosophy in this book. They are dwelling on practice. So they're steering away from the philosophy and the idea, the sanitized idea, and a very hand-picked philosophy of yoga to nitty-gritty practice. And second thing they are steering away from is they're steering away from the hegemony of a few major texts which were valorized in the 19th century and going to the minor texts which look at practice. So just these two, there are many things they're steering away from, but just these two things are extremely important, especially from where we stand today and having to deal with the ideas that we're dealing with, because these ideas of yoga and dance actually determine our national identity and how we define ourselves and how we define even nationalism today. I don't want to go into it too much, but these are, like I keep saying, that till we could not tame the yogi who was a militant, and till we could not moralize the Devadasi, we would not have a moral India or a modern India. Because modern India had to be demure, pious, spiritual, moral, rational, all those things. And these practices don't really concern with themselves with morality or things like that. So without going any further into this, I want to start our conversation here and draw both the speakers and the authors into it. And what I would really like to hear more about from both of you, I'm not going to go too much into the text. I've read a bit of it because this information is already there. I would like to hear and maybe talk about, thank you. About two things. Let's begin maybe with the hegemony of the texts. So which are these texts which have sort of become like the syllabi of yoga today, all over the world? And what is the politics of this hegemony?
Until recently, I think we'd seen a situation where when people wanted to refer to the texts of yoga, there were a handful of texts, particularly the Yoga Sutras or the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, as it calls itself. And then, other texts such as particular Upanishads, say, and a triad of texts of Hatha Yoga, the Hatha Pradipika, the Gheranda Samhita, and the Shiva Samhita. And maybe I'll speak about the modern kind of reception of these texts, and then Jim can continue. But the Patanjali Yoga Shastra has a quite a distinct modern history as well as an ancient one that goes back centuries as a kind of key text of the philosophy of yoga, and in the modern period, the Yoga Sutras, the sutra portion of that text is kind of taken out of its wider context. That's to say, with the so-called bhashya, and becomes a kind of iconic text that is seen to be at the foundation of all yoga, particularly of this kind of transnational, globalized yoga that Navtej was just talking about in the modern period. And it's that's not to say that it hasn't been a vitally important text through tradition, through the centuries, but it's kind of eclipsed many other texts, and it became a focus of scholarly attention in the mid 19th century, and particularly by foreign scholars looking for texts that would provide philosophy, a kind of philosophical basis for say the darshanas, which of course included yoga and Sankhya, etc. And we see it today, that beginning, and we also have Vivekananda who focuses on the Yoga Sutras in his book Raja Yoga, which became, according to some scholars, the blueprint for modern yoga that would follow, particularly English language versions of modern yoga. And so scholars, practitioners, everybody's kind of looking at the Yoga Sutras, or at these few Hatha Yoga texts that are available, and little attention is being paid to some of these other texts that we use in here, and we use all of those texts, including the Patanjali Yoga Shastra and the Hatha Pradipika in here, but along with these other lesser known texts. And just I think one more thing, just to echo what you were just saying. In yoga scholarship, there has been, I think, a tendency to see yoga as a monolith, as something that has kind of always existed in its fully formed state. And he gets a lot of bashing these days, but Mircea Eliade, who wrote Yoga, Immortality and Freedom, which became a kind of Bible of yoga scholarship throughout the second half of the 20th century, was certainly somebody who promoted this idea, I think, of a Indian spirituality that is ageless, and by bringing that into his work, I think makes some mistakes with regard to the dating of texts and the sort of stratification and the development of yoga, particularly in his dating of the so-called Yoga Upanishads to as contemporaneous with certain parts of the Mahabharata. And of course those Yoga Upanishads, as Christian Bouy has demonstrated, are much, much later, kind of 17th, 18th century. So that kind of tendency, I think, has been quite a force in keeping yoga, preventing a kind of more nuanced approach to yoga studies.
So, sorry, before I start, I'd just like to say thanks very much to Navtej and actually Mark. Between them, they've organised this event, so thank you very much, and delighted to be here, and thank you all very much for coming. I suppose I can pick up here from what Mark was saying about Mircea Eliade, in that the histories of yoga up until now have been written just based on a handful of texts, and in fact that sort of there was a kind of anti-textual tendency within scholarship, particularly in America, in the kind of history of religions tradition over the last 30 or 40 years. But it was when, as Sunil mentioned, my PhD thesis was on a text called the Khetri Vidya. So that was a critical edition from manuscripts of this text, which hadn't been published before and had fallen out of use as well. No one was reading the manuscripts anymore. But when I completed that work, it became clear to me that the received history of yoga really didn't match what we find in the textual sources, and I think that's always going to be the case. When you base a history on just a very small number of sources here and there. Now that was a hard thing to rectify, because actually to really dig out the texts and to bring them into usable form, translate them and so forth is really hard, painstaking work, which is not suited to everyone. In fact, there's very few of us around the world, a few in India and a few outside of India, who still perform the task of critically editing texts from manuscripts and so forth. And then amongst those few people, very few of them, very few kind of hardcore philologists, as we might call them, are interested in yoga, in particular Hatha Yoga, the sort of more esoteric or bizarre practices. So that's one of the things behind the reasons for doing this book, is that over the last 20 years, I and a few others have been working on these texts. So now we have a lot more material on which to base a new history of yoga. Navtej hinted at politics. I think it's any politics behind this. I don't think that it's particularly sort of political in a larger global position, but the academic politics behind it were perhaps this kind of post-colonial, post-structuralist, anti-theory, anti-textual position, which I think people are beginning to react against, because it's very easy if someone says something about the history of yoga, and then you can produce a text that says no, actually it doesn't. That's not what happened. Here the text says this. And people can't really argue with that anymore. So people are now beginning to recognise that we do need a good textual foundation on which to build a history of yoga. And we hope. I mean, this is a starting point, to be honest. Okay, I think we've moved things on a long way, but still there's plenty of work to be done. Luckily, because that's what we like doing, and so that's why with this project that I'm working on at the moment with Mark, we're going to be critically editing 10 texts which are key to the development of Hatha Yoga, which have just not been considered by scholars before at all. And it's been very exciting so far. And so we've used bits of just about all of those texts, the bits that we've worked on already in the book, and they've already shed new insights. We'll probably come on to this, but with the latest of the texts is a text called the Hatabiasapadati, probably from the 18th or 19th century, and that shows a real development in asana practice within the Indian tradition before any engagement with the West. Some people have said, asana practice only developed into the state that it's in now because of a Western fixation with body practice and so forth. But no, we can see that there was some development going on in India before that. And then going right back to the first text of the 10 that we're editing, again, everyone until now has assumed that Hatha Yoga, Hatha Yoga is yoga in which physical practices predominate, but it's not a kind of obscure sideline. It actually comes to be, it gets taken on by the Orthodox over the last 500 years. So in fact, these yoga Upanishads that Mark was talking about, that Eliade got completely wrong with his dating of, they were cobbled together in the sort of 17th, 18th centuries from earlier Hatha Yoga texts. So a lot of the texts that we're working on in the project. And one of the texts that they use is the earliest one we're editing, a text called the Amrita Siddhi, which has proved to be absolutely fascinating, and I could easily talk for an hour just about that. But one of the things, so it's the first text to teach any of the principles and practices of Hatha Yoga, and one of the big discoveries we've made so far, because we finally got hold of a manuscript from the 12th century, is that this text is actually written by Tantric Buddhists. Okay, until now I'd assumed, I found this really hard to kind of shift my mental framework of the history of yoga when I've been reading this text with colleagues. But now it's become kind of incontrovertible. It's totally clear to me that this text was written by Tantric Buddhists. So this is just to show that there's still a lot more to be discovered out there. But we think the book is a big leap forward from what's been published hitherto.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll take you. I'll be fair and democratic here. I have one more large question, which has little questions and sub-questions, so to speak. But before I go into that, I'd like to kind of just frame this conversation one more time. I think there's a distinct division between Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. There's a distinct division between pre-colonial and post-colonial. And so end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, something is a shift, and something is majorly a shift. I call it the shift in premise, so to speak. And I would like to place asana in the middle, in the cusp of that shift. I really think asana is super significant in terms of looking at the body, looking at practices and all that stuff. So I, at least for the listeners, I like this, framework to be there, that let's maybe try to look at this, a view and read and practice within this framework as well. The question that or the thing that I'd like to talk about or hear about is that in the last 100 or 200 years, there has been this drive of unification. There's a unified sense of Hinduism, and there's a unified sense of yoga. So all the schools of thought which are distinct and which jealously guard their distinct territory, so to speak, all become, morphed into one another. And so I'd like to kind of, talk about, like to recreate some distinctions between things that were historically or which have become morphed. And there's a list of things that I'd like to talk about, which are also addressed in the book. And maybe we can begin with the idea of yoga itself, the definition of yoga itself, because the double-edged idea of yoga, that yoga as practice or a method and yoga as a goal. So these are two distinct things, that what is yoga as a goal and what is yoga as a method or a practice. So if we can hear a little bit about that. So maybe we can go one thing at a time, and time permitting, we can maybe exhaust this.
Sure. Okay. So I think these days, yoga is often foremost conceived of as a practice. When you say yoga, you think of something that you do. But of course, in most of the texts, I think that we look at, yoga is the word yoga actually indicates the goal rather than the thing that you do to reach the goal. And so all those practices that we're used to perhaps thinking of as yoga are in fact in some sense ancillary to yoga itself. For example, the Ashtanga section of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, all of those sort of 8 elements, including posture and breathing and concentration, up to samadhi itself, are in fact only methods and means towards yoga, such that actually samadhi sort of plays this double role in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra as a practice that you do, but also as the state that you reach. And so it kind of sets up a kind of ambiguity with thinking through exactly what compounds like Hatha Yoga or Mantra Yoga mean. Are we talking there about a form of yoga called Hatha Yoga, or are we talking about yoga, the state of yoga that is attained through a method called Hatha or through a method called Mantra? And I think this oscillation is there in quite a lot of some of the texts that we look at. It's hard to tell which one is which, and therefore it's quite hard to sort of translate. And it's I think it's fairly clunky each time to say sort of yoga by means of Hatha, and so on. And if you want to say more about this, but it's something to bear in mind when today yoga is marketed, let's say, as a practice, that one does, and when arguably, and perhaps we can come back to this, the goals of yoga and the sort of end point, the results of yoga practice today are often conceived quite differently than they were in pre-modern times, let's say.
I haven't got much to add to that, apart from just to emphasise that point. We haven't done a sort of statistical survey, but I'd say that 95% of the instances of yoga in the text that we've translated here, it means the goal and not the practice. There's one or two. There's an odd, obscure one where it sort of says something like, "If you do your yoga wrong, you'll get hurt" or something. So there, it's clearly the practice, But yeah, it then leaves open the question. Okay, so what are the practical things that lead to yoga? Because you can, as Mark was indicating with these compounds, mantra yoga, laya yoga, hatha yoga, you could put anything behind yoga, and then that's the way of achieving the final goal, which is yoga. So at the same time, despite having said that, there is a kind of consensus as to what the practices that lead to yoga are, and that seems to coalesce, as I mentioned, over the last 500 years, there becomes a sort of broad consensus across a variety of different traditions. So that's what we've aimed at identifying the roots of within this book. Otherwise, we could, you could include just about anything. So we needed some way of narrowing the focus.
And that yoga would be effectively Hatha Yoga.
Yes, I suppose so. But yes, although within the orthodox treatments, Hatha Yoga kind of melded with Patanjali Yoga, I think, becomes the kind of dominant form. Yeah.
So this kind of dovetails into the next question, which is, or the distinction between, like today, yoga is the morphed version of yoga does not make a distinction between Patanjali Yoga and Hatha Yoga, and they are, I would say, they're chalk and cheese. So can we segregate those, please?
Do you want to go first on this one?
Okay. Yeah. Well, it's not something that's only being done in modern yoga, trying to bring the two together. I mean, as I say, over the last 500 years within the Indian tradition as well, that's what's been going on. It's one of the many things that the kind of orthodox Hindu mainstream, they has always had this genius for appropriating ideas that have appeared outside of it and then making them, bringing them into the mainstream and making them orthodox, which is what has happened with these Hatha Yoga practices. So I don't think there's necessarily, there is to some extent a tension, I suppose. People nowadays, I think in certain traditions of modern yoga, Mark will know more about this than I do, but there are a great deal, within schools that place a lot of emphasis on asana practice and doing various different postures and so forth. That's kind of at the forefront of the teachings. They also put the Patanjali's Yoga Shastra on a pedestal, perhaps chanted at the beginning of their asana sessions and so forth. And there is clearly nothing more than seated postures taught within the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. So if we look at the sutras and the commentary that go with it, so the commentators and the texts that were put together over the last 500 years, they have to some extent reconcile themselves to this. Although there is, I suppose, there's a cop-out in there which is exploited in that Vyasa, I should make it clear now. We've been using this sort of this mouthful of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra rather than just saying the Yoga Sutras, because the scholarly consensus now is that the commentary and the root texts were compiled at the same time. Okay, and at the end, and within the sutras, there's really very little said about posture. But then within the commentary, we get a list of 12, and at the end it says ityadini, so etc. Okay, so there's a little loophole. So you can say, okay, then you can bring in the 84 asanas and so forth. Which has always been the genius of the Indian tradition, is being able to read things into older texts and rework new ideas into put new wine into old casks and so forth. So I don't have too much of a problem with that, of people trying to reconcile the two, seeing as how that's just that's a relatively old tradition that's being continued to this day.
I guess I'd add that Raja Yoga is a component part of Hatha Yoga in later Hatha texts, at least like the Hatha Pradipika. It's there, and it doesn't, I think in that context, refer to Patanjali Yoga. But just to sort of emphasize what Jim was saying, that there is a kind of merger of Patanjali Yoga and Hatha Yoga in these later centuries, which makes the kind of modern division between Hatha Yoga as a merely physical practice and Raja Yoga as a more elevated mental practice quite hard to sustain. And this kind of idea, I think, gains a lot of ground through the work of Vivekananda on the one hand and the Theosophical Society on the other. That somehow Hatha Yoga is lower and just less elevated than Raja Yoga, which is identified with meditation. But in fact, in practice, I think that distinction is quite hard to draw, given that they are often seen as part of the same package.
Okay, this is something that we can go on. Would you like to say a little bit something about Raja Yoga? Because it's a.
No, we were talking. Tej and I were talking about this earlier, and he knows I have some rather unorthodox interpretations of Raja Yoga. because within the early textual tradition, so my work focuses on the sort of early formative textual tradition of Hatha Yoga, and within there, Raja Yoga, as Mark pointed out, this sort of distinction between mental and physical for Raja and Hatha is a sort of a relatively modern creation, perhaps attributed to, often attributed to Vivekananda. I think there's a few slightly earlier examples. But within the early texts of Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga is rather reinterpreted as the yoga of kings. Okay, so this seems to be, in fact, and this is also very important for understanding the whole point of these texts, actually, because a lot of the practices of yoga, almost all of the practices of yoga, I think were developed within ascetic traditions, the sadhus and so forth, these wandering yogis, and were passed on within those traditions orally. Okay, and then the purpose of the text is in fact to communicate some of these practices, not all of them, but to a wider general, householder, non-ascetic audience. And so one of the kind of the implicit meanings of Raja Yoga is yoga for kings. Okay, so you can practice yoga, and there are various techniques. So there are some quite esoteric ones which enable you, to make love as much as you want without losing your ojas, however you want to put it, and so forth. And that is seen, that is then interpreted as Raja Yoga, because you're able to live like a king in enjoying bhoga, effectively, enjoying the fruits of a kind of householder existence, while at the same time reaping the benefits of being a yogi. So this seems to be the promise of a lot of these texts, is that if you do these practices, you can get what these great yogis who retire to the Himalayas for 12 years and live in a cave, what they get through their practice. You can actually do this whilst remaining, and it says this quite specifically, quite explicitly in some texts, that you can, if you do these practices, you can live at home surrounded by the chaos of your wife and children. I'm afraid they're always aimed at men, and still get all the benefits of yoga. So that's another understanding of Raja Yoga we find in the early texts. That's not the only one. There's also Raja Yoga in the earliest Hatha Yoga text is also associated with these practices that kind of collectively called amanaska, so kind of mindless, a way of emptying the mind, and Raja Yoga itself is said to be the same as samadhi. But there is very much so this underlying notion of Raja Yoga being the yoga for kings. You can be a yogi and a king at the same time.
Thank you. Let's go to the next distinction. I mean, I'm just talking of distinctions between yoga as a means of inflicting like mortification of the body, as opposed to cultivation or celebration, rather, maybe, of the body.
Well, again, to start from the modern, I think there is a consensus that yoga is supposed to be good for your health, in the sense that it makes you healthy and hopefully free from illness, and it's conducive to relaxed states of mind, all of that. But there's also a tradition, and perhaps the dominant tradition within at least ascetic yoga practitioner circles, that yoga destroys the body or drives a wedge between the spiritual principle and the physical body. And this is achieved through various techniques of baking, where the body's mortified, and will I think come on later to the to the notion of tapas as practice, and how that relates to particularly Hatha Yoga, but earlier forms of yoga as well. And so there is a kind of binary here that starts to shift when we move into the heyday of Hatha Yoga, where practices such as asana, such as pranayama, can can bring physical benefits and have therapeutic benefits that we see then increasingly occurring in later texts, in later Hatha Yoga texts, and which no doubt sort of feed into the modern medicalized version of yoga that we often see today, where yoga's efficacy is to be tested by biomedical methods, and I'm sure you've seen those wonderful photos from sort of 1920s in Lonavala, in the Kaivalya Dham Institute, where they started kind of this biomedical research with these yogis hooked up to EEGs and all sorts of equipment to measure, to give an index of the efficacy and success of these yoga practices, which is quite an interesting idea, and that I think takes us a long way from prior understandings of what yoga is and does. Yes, I think that'll do, and that's kind of that kind of model of yoga as within sort of healthism, I think has pushed a lot of other ideas out to the point which to the point where I think to suggest within a kind of global modern yoga framework, or in a modern yoga class, that this the purpose of this is actually to mortify the body and to sort of separate those two principles, let's say, as it might be in some ascetic traditions, would just not be acceptable. Just one more thing. I think the idea of yoga as a practice of body, mind, and spirit, meaning that yoga sort of harmonizes these three aspects of the human being is also a fairly modern idea that we can trace, and that isn't necessarily the model of the body and the spirit and the mind that we see prior to the modern period.
Yes, so in our early formulations of yoga, it's closely associated with tapas, and this, I think, this is what Mark was getting at when he said the baking of the body. And in Patanjali, it's one of the auxiliaries of yoga practices, performing tapas, and it's very clear. So tap comes from the root to heat, and the idea is that by doing various practice, the most extreme being these great mortifications of standing up for years on end and so forth, you dry up the body. And this is made very clear in early texts that usually the best form of tapas is said to be fasting, and that makes your body shrivel up. And then we get stories in the epics, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Puranas and so forth, of these ascetics who are very emaciated, but at the same time kind of glowing with some sort of inner radiance, the power of this tapas that it gives them. But then Mark was saying that if one tried to explain to yoga practitioners today that yoga was all about this, that they would they wouldn't be very happy. But in fact, that tension appears, at least already 1,000 years ago in the texts, particularly with these texts of Hatha Yoga. We see it from 1,000 years ago. First mentions of actual physical benefits that some of these practices might have, but then the texts have this difficulty of explaining tapas, and the meaning slowly gets kind of changed and altered. And I won't go. I think we go in the book. We go through the various different permutations. But as I said, first of all, tapas is identified with these fairly extreme fasting methods. But by the latest text that this Hatabiasapadati that we're working on in the project we're on at the moment, tapas is then defined as swadharmacharanam. So observing one's own caste duty, one's own life duty, that becomes seen as austerity. So it's kind of dissociated from extreme practices completely. And again, this is all part of these methods, these techniques that were developed by ascetic yogis, then being reworked and being sort of repackaged for you and me, for ordinary people, hopefully be able to gain some benefit from them.
Great. Could we talk a little bit more about the idea of extreme? Because it's so and then as we modernize or whatever, we take that edge off the extreme. And what is this thing of this, taking the edge off?
I'm happy to pick that one up. Yeah, the word. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of native speakers here who know that the word "hut" in itself kind of means extreme, to do something to an extreme, to do something to great insistence. And of course, this project we're working on at the moment, the Hatha Yoga project, one of the things we look at is what is the meaning of Hatha Yoga. And if one looks in the text that we deal with, Hatha Yoga is generally identified with certain practices. It's seen, or Hatha is seen as the method of achieving yoga. It's identified with certain predominantly physical practices, these mudras, asanas, breathing techniques, and so forth. But then last year, it was the end of 2015, I was at the Nasik Kumbh Mela, walking down to bathe on one of the Shahi Snan days with the camp where I was staying. And there was these big sort of municipal posters were put up, and one of them was saying in Hindi, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but upahas na uraye at these sadhus who are either jatavale, nange, or hatha yogi. Okay, and so I had to think, well, hang on, here we are studying these formal Sanskrit texts of hatha yoga. It's meant to be this, this august tradition. Yet here are signs asking people not to laugh at hatha yogis. What's going on there? And I think, and I mean, I'm sure most people here know as well as I do that the sense there of Hatha Yoga, and in fact part of the project we've got at the moment, it's not just a textual project. We've got anthropological fieldwork going on. We've got a postdoctoral researcher, Daniela, who's been going around and meeting yogis, searching out Hatha yogis. And one of the things she's been doing at the beginning of the project is trying to understand the meaning of Hatha Yoga. And it's clear that it's associated with these extreme practices. And I think that meaning is also there in the Sanskrit text, actually, and because it slowly gets sidelined. And in fact, even though the Yoga Upanishads borrow from all these Hatha Yoga texts, they hardly use the word Hatha at all. And within one of the later texts of the kind of core texts of Hatha Yoga, the word Hatha gets reinterpreted, and it's said to be Ha is the sun. I normally get this the wrong way around. Ha is the sun, Ta is the moon, and Hatha Yoga is their union. But of course, Hatha is a very common Sanskrit and Hindi word, which means to do something forcefully, to the max, to the extremes. And you can't eclipse that meaning just by putting a kind of esoteric meaning on it. So I think that tension is there all the way through. And in fact, the kind of clinch to me, actually, it's clear that Hatha means extreme practice, was looking, and I don't read Tamil, but I've been looking at a translation of the Tirumantaram, which is probably 13th, 14th century epic sort of tantric work with lots of yoga in it. And there it repeats the fourfold system of yogas that we find in some early Hatha Yoga texts. And instead of hatha, it uses the word tapa, meaning tapas. Okay, so it just equates hatha and tapas. So yes, I think this is the physical practices taught in these texts were, and again, as I was saying to Navtej earlier, not all of the extreme, well, none of the really extreme practices are actually found in the text. There's no Sanskrit manual that tells you how to hold your hands in the air for 12 years or how to stand up for 12 years or something like that. Those things are all passed down orally. Okay, so what we find in the text are actually the things that maybe normal people can do. Okay, so it's coming away from the hatha. All right, thank you.
And that continues, I think, down, through into the modern period with the reclamation, in some respects, of Hatha Yoga as a kind of gentle practice, and outside of India, at least, if it's in Europe or in America, generally, if you ask people what Hatha means, they'll give you that definition from the Yoga Bija, which says that Ha is sun and Ta is moon. but won't be familiar with the more common meaning of this kind of forceful practice. And indeed, Hatha Yoga has become Hatha Yoga, and one among many brands of yoga, including Bikram Yoga, Ashtanga Yoga, Iyengar Yoga, and so on, that are very popular now across the world. And what Hatha Yoga means in that context is a particularly gentle practice that's used to distinguish it from more rigorous postural practices like, say, Ashtanga Yoga or Iyengar Yoga. And so in some respects we've had a complete reversal where, as Jim was saying, in these earlier texts, Hatha means something quite forceful. Now it means quite the opposite. It's used to distinguish yoga practice from those other kinds of forceful practices.
One last thing before we kind of, hopefully one last thing. One last distinction between Kundalini Yoga, Kundalini and Bindu, the idea of between these two practices. And Bindu.
Go ahead.
So this is something I've written about quite a bit in sort of relatively obscure academic journals and so forth. So this is the first time in the book that I've given it a kind of more public airing. So a lot of the work on the Hatha Yoga corpus is derived from looking at a text called the Hatha Pradipika, or generally known as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. Okay, but for the reasons we were talking about earlier, that's actually, it's never called that within the manuscripts themselves. So it's the Hatha Pradipika, and that was written probably around 1450, or perhaps I shouldn't say written, but compiled, because starting with the work of Christian Bouy in the early 90s, he published a kind of seminal book that really, he's a French scholar, that it was thanks to his book that I then decided to work on the Khetri Vidya, and he identified a dozen or so texts that were used to compile the Hatha Pradipika, and then I think we've now identified 20 or so, and found pretty much all of these, with the ones we've identified we've clearly found, but there's very few parts of it of the Hatha Pradipika that we haven't identified antecedents for. And so the Hatha Pradipika is this big kind of mix of various different teachings on yoga, and often they're somewhat contradictory, particularly in the models of the yogic body. And it was through reading the actual text that it quotes from, in particular this one I mentioned earlier, the Amrita Siddhi, which is probably from about the 11th century. So that the text that the Hatha Pradipika uses to compile, some of them do teach, fully coherent systems which make perfect sense within themselves. And this Amrita Siddhi teaches a yogic physiology in which the purpose of some of the physical practices is to stop this substance called Bindu, which is formed in the head, and again it's always a male physiology, although it does actually sometimes, some of the texts say that the feminine counterpart is a substance called Rajas. Bindu is formed in the head, in the moon in the head, and is constantly dripping down, and is then either ejaculated as semen or burnt up in the stomach. And through this constant process, men get older and die. And so the practices taught in this text are used to stop that. And we find this also in subsequent texts. So that the most obvious way of doing it is to use gravity. So the headstand is explained as a way of keeping Bindu in the head. And I think it's the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra is the first text to teach it, and explicitly says if you do it for 3 hours a day, you won't die because your store of Bindu won't run out. Now, so this is quite a coherent, quite a simple, crude model, really, of what's going on in the yogic body. So other practices like Khetri Mudra, where you stick your tongue back above your palate, that's meant to seal the Bindu in the head and stop it dripping. And then, actually earlier, we got earlier textual evidence from the tantric traditions of the Kundalini model of the body. But in those earlier traditions, it's not really seen as something physical. Kundalini and the chakras are things that you visualize within your body. Okay, you may feel accompanying sensations as you as you make Kundalini rise, but essentially they're kind of mentally created, they're visualized. And what we see in the Hatha Pradipika and a couple of earlier Hatha Yoga texts is the mixing of these two traditions. So the Tantric Kundalini traditions, lineages, take on this ascetic Bindu yoga model, and this creates sort of some complications, in particular because within the Bindu model, you want to hold this substance in the head, whereas the Kundalini model, which we find in the earlier tantras, she rises up the central channel and then accesses this pool of the nectar of immortality in the brain, in the skull, and then she goes back down to where she started from. And as she does this, she floods the body with this stuff, with this amrita, and that makes the body, rejuvenates it, makes it immortal. So you've got these two conflicting paradigms, one in which you've got to keep this stuff in the head, and the other with which you've got to flood the body with it. And in fact, you get both things in the Hatha Pradipika, so that's an example of why, it has these kind of conflicting, slightly contradictory models of the body. There are something actually I still haven't quite made sense of, because you do get some rather obscure references to kind of, I think maybe this is within the texts themselves trying to make sense of, trying to reconcile this contradiction, but they start talking about sort of secret back channels where things can flow back and forth and so forth. But I haven't neither practically or theoretically have made much sense of that yet. But maybe there's a way around, but we'll have to wait for the next book.
That the question you raised about the status of the chakras, I think, is also a very interesting one. That they're objects for meditation. They're kind of imagined, and they're not necessarily within the body either. As in some contexts, if the practitioner isn't able to sort of visualize them internally, they can visualize them externally. But we also see a kind of physicalization of the chakras themselves in some ways, particularly in some later Hatha Yoga texts like the Hatha Ratnavali, where the chakras can actually be purified by gross means, by using the shatkarmas, these sort of physical cleansings that actually cleanse the chakras. So they by that stage they become physical entities, which is an idea that then carries through, I think, into the modern era, where the chakras can actually be seen in the same way that sort of nerve endings can be seen, or plexuses can be seen. And this idea, I think, is an interesting one to kind of trace back, because it's certainly how chakras are understood now, as things that can be monitored and seen either through Kirlian photography or and there's a story of Dayananda in the early 20th century when that I wrote about in Yoga Body. Where he's traveling around India looking for teaching on yoga, and he's carrying all his books with him. And he's fascinated by this idea of the chakras. And then, one day he finds a corpse in the river and thinks, now's my chance. So he pulls the corpse out of the river, takes his knife and opens up the body in order to find these chakras. And when he doesn't find them, in disgust, he takes his yoga books and throws them in the river, keeping, I think, only the Bhagavad Gita and Patanjali, perhaps. So this kind of oscillation between what's real and what's not, I think, is worth sort of further thought. Yeah, that's it really. The ontological status of the body. I think it's kind of it's really worth sort of knowing what the status of these kind of this yogic physiology is, because it's not always the same. And neither is the map of the body, of course, that we see. I mean, that there are many different maps, many different schemas of chakras, many different ideas about where they are, how many there are. And at least in, again, just to finish with kind of globalized modern yoga, there's an idea that the chakras are 7. Which I think probably comes from the success of Arthur Avalon's translation of the Shat Chakra Nirupanam, in which, of course, there are 6 plus Sahasra. That's displaced other ideas about how many chakras there are, but not only in modernity, but also within tradition for various reasons that perhaps I won't go into, about transmission of this model from a text called the Kubjikamata Tantra, that subsequently had 2 transmissions through the Nats and the Dashanami Sannyasins, and hence sort of became one, a particularly prevalent model of the yogic body, but which is by no means the only one.
Can I say one quick point? Because I know Navtej was hoping we might say something about Vedanta, although for various reasons, people. Anyway, I think there's a relevant point here, actually, just to sort of maybe perhaps illustrate why we haven't said anything about Vedanta, is that today people often associate, understand the yogic body to also be to be associated with this notion of the 5 koshas, Annamaya kosha, Pranamaya kosha, etc. Now, we have a little passage on this in the book, in that it's not mentioned in any yoga text whatsoever. Okay, so this is just to show you that, in fact, the yoga, nowadays the notion of yoga and that yoga and Vedanta have always been kind of intertwined and part of an ancient heritage is not borne out by the text at all, and they seem to be completely distinct traditions. There's no mention of koshas in. I think there's one very brief, like 3-word mention in one commentary on one late medieval text. Other than that, they do not appear in yoga texts.
Very good. I have one more thing, but my one question, and we can take a vote, is about the influence of Buddhism on yoga. If can we go into that question, or would we? Yeah. Okay.
Buddhist influence on yoga.
I'll say a few words. Well, I already mentioned this text, Amrita Siddhi, which is the sort of foundational text of Hatha Yoga, which was clearly written by Tantric Vajrayana Buddhists. And this is something we're still trying to process, work out how. I've recently been looking into, because a lot of the verses from that text are then taken up in texts from the Nat yogi traditions. I've been looking recently, a lot of my work's been on how this might have happened on the ground in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. But if we go back earlier, I mean, we were talking about the hegemony of Patanjali's Yoga Shastra within studies of yoga. And I think, actually only in the course of writing this book, and we could have probably put more about it in the book, it became clear how important the Yogacara Buddhist traditions were in the early development of yoga. And in fact, we have far more material in the Yogacara Bhumi and related texts from about the same time as Patanjali. And this is obviously it's because of Buddhism effectively disappearing from India by the 13th, 14th centuries or whenever, that it's been somewhat overlooked in the early history. But we do include a lot of Buddhist passages on, particularly in the meditation section. It seems pretty clear that Buddhist traditions were very influential in the development of meditative practice in an early period. And again, this is, it's one of the, as I mentioned earlier, this sort of the process of practices that arise outside of the mainstream, then being absorbed into mainstream religious practice. This seems to have happened with practices developed within Buddhism quite a bit. Yeah, so I think we've done it justice in the book to a great extent. Although perhaps with hindsight now, we might have used another passage or two from Yogacara sources, because I think it's a hugely unused source for the early history of yoga.
Indeed, and scholars, I think, have seen for a long time the influences in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra that come from Buddhism, such as de la Vallée Poussin, back, I don't even know what date that was, long time ago, and others, have sort of compiled lists of this influence. So there was certainly a dialogue going on, and as Jim was mentioning. As far back as in the Mahabharata, we have references to this practice of dhyana yoga, which is with reference to Buddhist practitioners specifically. Also, the exchange between tantric traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism is, I think, clear to see, and many of the same practices, particularly the meditative practices of visualization and so forth, are very clearly shared between those two traditions. We also, I don't think we do include a passage from Tibetan physical yoga practice in the book, a method called Trulkur, which is sometimes translated into English as Yantra Yoga, and that was taught by Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. And there's a book now called Yantra Yoga, which looks in many ways like Hatha Yoga, like Indian Hatha Yoga. But in fact, it appears that there's no direct connection or no direct influence in this particular case, which I think you had corroborated recently by a Tibetan Lama who said no, it's either Chinese influence or the native Burn Tibetan religious influence. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, it was Ian Baker, actually, not a Lama. Although I think there's one or two things in this Amrita Siddhi text that maybe are matched by what practices we see in Trulkur. So this is again, ground for further research.
Okay, I guess we can now open the floor to questions to both Mark and James. Yes.
Especially in the beginning when you were talking about dates and when certain traditions coalesce and transformations happen. This is just a very intuitive kind of question from looking at Bengal and Mysore. And the development of asana as a kind of visual technique, like for example in temple sculptures or in, say, visualization, very textual visualization, seems to somehow connect to larger social and historical changes in the colonial period. And that I'm seeing it very, with a little bit of research, some instinctual. So that leads me to a larger question, not just within text, but how does the change of, say, goal versus practice shift at different historical moments? That's my question.
Maybe I could talk a little bit about earlier stuff, and you could move on to the colonial period. And
okay, sure.
Goal versus practice. Well, I think within the ascetic traditions of yoga, generally the goal has been liberation of some sort. But then within the tantric traditions and also the Hatha Yoga traditions as taught, to householders, there's always been this kind of dual possibility of you can either be a mumukshu, so someone who's desiring moksha, liberation, or you can be a bubhukshu, someone who's desiring bhoga, so pleasures, and that's always equated with siddhis, so various kind of powers, material powers. And in fact, some of the texts that we include translations from in the book demonstrate that, you know, people today might go, oh gosh, you know, yoga has become this awful sort of selfish, material, part of a self-obsessed modern culture. But in fact, you know, some of the texts promise that you'll lose all your wrinkles and your grey hair, and you'll become extremely attractive to the opposite sex, and so forth. You know, and those are from 500 or 600 years ago. So again, perhaps that, you know, I guess it's kind of sort of advertising pitch to the ordinary person out there. But I think the goals haven't necessarily shifted that much. Certainly in the pre-modern period.
Well, I think you're asking about visual culture. I think the facility with which the body could be represented through photography, lithographs, and so on, coming into the, you know, in the later stages of the colonial period into the 20th century, change the status perhaps of posture practice. And that's not to say that there aren't many representations of asana around. I mean, we've just come back from Daboy, where we're looking at the 12th century gate there with multiple, I don't know how many actually, of advanced kind of complex postural sculptures. But as we come into the modern age, it seems to me that the mass reproduction of images of yoga valorizes posture over practices that can't quite so readily be seen, like pranayama practice, let's say, or mudra, most of them, or meditation, let's say. And I'd suggest that in some respects the explosion of postural yoga throughout the world is only possible because of these reproductive techniques that you can actually show very quickly and easily what it is that you should be doing in a posture with a photo much more easily than you can with just words. And in fact, some of the texts that we're looking at were often really at quite a loss to know what's going on in, you know, very, very short sort of descriptions of postures. But so we've spent some very enjoyable mornings in the office in London trying these out. You know, I think we will all come up with a different version of what it is. Whereas with a photo, you know. So I'd say just that has in some sense changed what has altered the goal of the practice, and continues to sort of change the way that yoga is perceived and the way that the body is perceived. It has, I think, become something of a spectacle, especially now with I don't even know what these apps are called, where Instagram, is it? Where the performance aspect of posture sometimes takes over from other goals of posture.
Jeff in the front first.
There are two questions. One is about samadhi. I'll come to that in a minute. And the first one is the cause and effect. The origin of yoga in India. There must have been a need for something for people to have come up with this. And why not in other parts of the world? And where does religion come into this? Because quite often when they say the practice of yoga should be taught in schools, there are non-Hindus who object to it. So I would like your reactions. So
on the last point, I think you might object to being forced to practice yoga on other grounds, but I think not necessarily on religious grounds. I mean, one of the points we make in the book, in fact, is that within the Indian traditions of Indian religious traditions, there are very broad a range, and most of them practice yoga. Okay, so it's not as though yoga is restricted to one particular philosophical or religious viewpoint, which is why there's very little philosophy in the book. And in fact, some texts explicitly say, so the first text to teach Hatha Yoga explicitly says it doesn't matter if you're Buddhist or a Charvaka or a Brahmana or a Karpalaka, skull bearer, if you do your yoga practice assiduously, you will get wherever it is you want to go. Okay, so, and that seems pretty clear. Most of the yoga, I mean, obviously some yoga texts are taught, some texts on yoga are specific products of specific religious traditions, and then they will put their own spin on it. But it's clearly, there's one in one of the chapters in the book we point out that there's a sort of a cliche about, and often used within the context of Indian religions, that there are many paths leading to one goal. What the yoga texts in fact say is quite the reverse. There's one path leading to many goals. That's how we've flipped it around. So, because they say that quite clearly. To go back to evidence of why did it appear? Well, I think we do point out some kind of rather esoteric, but not, pretty conclusive. There's a passage from the Atharva Veda which talks about the breath and various homologies between the breath and the cosmos, which kind of is then echoed in later yoga texts. But it's not conclusive there. There's definitely no systematic yoga practice taught in the Vedic texts. And the first time we do get that is, or more solid references to yoga practice comes, or practices that we might identify as yogic come within the Buddhist traditions, and also parts of the Mahabharata, the Moksha Dharma, and so forth. And so this seems to be this period, and also the Jaina traditions as well. So this is appearing, perhaps 5th, 4th century BC, and there seems to have been some sort of social movement, some process in which there's a rejection of normal religion with its normal material goals, and there's the creation of these new ascetic movements. I mean, there are traces earlier on, but this is the first time you get kind of concrete, lots of good evidence showing this. So it seems to us, but we can't be sure. We've got very sketchy evidence from this period. It seems to us that the whole concept of yoga, whether it was called that as such, because in fact that's not clear who was calling it what at this early who was calling what at this early period, but it's that seems to be the period when it starts to flourish.
What was the question?
Sorry.
Samadhi was
do you want to answer that as well? Has question, or we have lots of hands?
Oh well, let's go to the
so
next one. Sorry.
yes. Okay. Actually, she raised her hand first, so let me try to stick to an order, please. Thank you.
Yeah, this is most interesting and fascinating. I have a couple of questions. I think yoga can be traced back not even 4th, 5th BCE, but actually Indus Valley civilization. That's what, at least certainly in some of the yogic postures, can be seen in many of the seals, particularly the Pashupati seal, the Paddakonasana, and many other seals also. Pardon? Yes, Sindhu Saraswati civilization. I have, one aspect whether you have sort of see it that way. I think the Ashtanga Yoga was the purpose of life. The purpose of human life is always to attain moksha, mumukshvatvam. And the ashramas, the brahmacharya grastha ashrama, vanaprastha, sannyasam, the Ashtanga Yoga has to be superimposed onto this, the 4 ashramas. Because if you have to, everybody had to live by the, for the 4 stages of life. And if the purpose of life was in fact to go towards attaining moksha and no rebirth, then these Ashtanga Yoga practices will always be woven into these ashramas. into the various stages of life. Well, that kind of a thing ever would have, I suppose, it might have existed, like that, from the time it sort of evolved. That it sort of, degenerated into the current times.
Is there a question coming at the end
so
of it?
I want to know what you think about it, whether you think that. The second question is that of the Bindu. I thought Bindu was always the vasam of the Devi, because that's what it says in the Lalita Shastranamam. And also the 7 chakras are so clearly given in the Lalita Sahasranamam from the Markandeya Purana. So what is the, when did that evolve, and what is your idea about that?
Okay, well, I'll start with the last bit, the Lalita Sahasranama and the 7 chakras. Well, that's part of this Sri Vidya Dakshinamnaya tradition of Tantra, in which the system of 7 or 6 plus 1 chakras develops. So that continues that lineage. But there are, as we point out in the book, there are plenty of other systems of different numbers of chakras within different tantric and both Shaiva Vaishnava and also Buddhist traditions as well. I mean, Buddhism, in the tantric Buddhist traditions, it's almost always 4 chakras, and there are lots of different systems. And it's, as Mark suggested, it may be. I mean, the Sri Vidya Dakshinamnaya tradition became associated with the Shankaracharya traditions, particularly in Sringeri in the south. So I think it's through that's one of the ways it got sort of promulgated. Bindu, yes, Bindu has all kinds of meanings in all kinds of texts. Often in tantric texts, it means a point. Bindu means a point or a drop. So it's a point on. It's often paired with nada, being a sound, and Bindu is a sort of nada is a kind of oral and a focus for meditation through sound, and Bindu through visual sources. But it's a point often located within the forehead that you meditate upon. But within these Hatha Yoga texts, Bindu takes on this new meaning of the drop, of meaning that referring to this liquid, this sort of life force that's produced within the head. And what was the question before? Sorry, the ashramas. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, the ashramas is the work of Patrick Olivelle, who's written quite a lot about the ashramas, and he's shown how, in fact, the earliest systems, it was a choice which ashrama you went in, and the graded, the sort of sequence of going from brahmachari, grahastha, vanaprastha, sannyasi, is actually a later formulation, and this seems to be, again, a way of the mainstream appropriating, trying to tame the ascetic, trying to tame the sannyasi and bring it within the fold, because obviously if everyone went off and became a renouncer living in the forest, society would fall apart. So this is a way of saying, no, you don't go and do that now when you're a young man. You have to go through your duties of life and then do it at the end, so that society can continue to function. So I'm not, I'm always a bit skeptical about this ashrama system being I'm not sure if the texts themselves, they generally, if they express an opinion, they'll say that obviously you're going to be better at yoga if you're a sannyasi, but that you can do it if you're in one of the other ashramas.
I just have 2 brief questions, other curiosities. When were the Yoga Shastras compiled? Because by 12th century BC, when Vedants or Upanishads were completed, yoga emerged. But coupled with that, there was a tradition not to reduce this sacred knowledge in writing, because it was whispered to keep it pure. That's one. Second is, as Navte George said, the centrality of asanas. If you don't make them central, what else remains? And lastly, one observation I was raised. I think there's a lot of ignorance about yoga. As a Muslim, let me tell you that all the postures of namaz are yogic postures. And it has been proved, and there's a lot has been written. And one more thing, that Darashikoh, the prince who was executed by Aurangzeb, he wrote in his book, Sir-e Akbar, the Great Secret, that all the knowledge found in the Quran is already found in the Upanishads. I think there's a lot of ignorance about that.
Yes, indeed. I think this also links back to your earlier question about the place of religion, and we have Islamic texts in the book, and there was a great interest in yoga among the Persian elite particularly, and some of the texts, such as the Bahr al-Hayat, which is in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, a manuscript, an incredible piece of work that shows these yoga practices and presents them in an Islamic framework, and in fact gives a lot more detail than we generally find within the Sanskrit texts. So absolutely, the yogic practices are there also in Islam, as well as in Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and across the board.
The date of the text. Do you want to?
Oh, sorry.
So Patanjali's text now currently the sort of range is 325 to 425 AD, and the reason that can be done is the reason it can be reasonably accurate is because it as mentioned earlier, it uses concepts from Buddhist texts which are also dated, so which were written slightly earlier. So that's how we get this, and then the first mention of the text itself comes in the middle of the 5th century, okay, in external sources. So that's how we can kind of give a sort of well, I say we. There's a scholar called Philip Mars who's been bringing out the latest kind of refining the dating that's got more and more refined over the years.
Centrality of asanas as used.
Well, in Patanjali's asana is not central at all. It's just a seat. It's just a seated posture that you assume for your meditation and breath control practices. So, I mean, obviously, it's central in that you have to master. But in fact, until relatively late within the textual tradition, a lot of texts say, of all these various asanas we've taught, it doesn't matter. You just choose the one which suits you best, and stick to that one. Okay, only ones, there's none of this notion of doing lots of different kinds of postures and so forth.
I just wanted to ask you about the distinction between the real and the imagined in the earlier texts. And do you think that...
Can you speak up?
I just wanted to ask you...
Hold the mic close to you.
Yeah. Wanted to ask you about the distinction between the real and the imagined that you mentioned in relation to the 19th century, especially with reference to Dayanand Saraswati's take on the chakras, when he's dissecting a human body to find out whether, the chakras actually exist in the physical body or not. And do you think that in the earlier texts, yoga texts, this distinction is not there? There is a kind of an oscillation, there is a kind of an interplay of the real and the imagined. And perhaps this shift is taking place in the 19th century. I think that Navtej perhaps might like to also say something about this, that in the 19th century, the distinction obviously sometimes is seen to be embedded in the kind of European rationality that is developing in India, and how the notion of body also undergoes transformation, where Dayanand is actually dissecting a physical body to perhaps decipher the presence, the reality, the real presence, the objective presence of the chakras. Whereas in the earlier, so my question is that, do you think that 19th century in that sense marks a shift with the earlier texts that are not possibly so much invested in making a distinction between the real and the imagined? And my second point just follows from that, is there a definite yoga tradition that we are working with in the pre-sort of 19th century context, right from the 15th century onwards? Because your talk very eloquently points out the contradictions and the inconsistencies and the kind of opposing forces in various traditions. If that is so, then aren't we talking about two distinctions here? I mean, in terms of yoga texts as emerging in the 19th century and their status in the pre-19th century, where there are other principles at work. For example, smriti, memory. How are these texts being kind of compiled? Is there an element of memory in this? Is there an element of practice in this? And perhaps the written is not somewhat hegemonizing the oral. I mean, these are just some questions.
Okay. Very, very good questions. Probably too many to address now, but yes, I'd say that a shift does occur in the 19th century with the rise of the empirical scientific worldview, where other shades of reality and imagination are sort of pushed aside in favor of concrete evidence, scientific evidence. And I've already spoken about the kinds of experiments that went on earlier in the 20th century and continue to go on today. But that line between the real and the imagined is never fixed, and depending on the context, it can move, as we saw, as I mentioned with regard to the chakras being things that you can actually physically purify, that are there, that you can kind of wash out with water, as opposed to sort of facets of a body that exist somewhere between reality and imagination. And we also see this in practices, in meditation practices, particularly within tantras, where the deity is visualized, but that visualization is in fact an all-encompassing sensorial kind of empathic experience of the deity. And at that point, to ask whether that's real or not becomes quite a vexed issue. How do you know? What do you mean by the real? And it also shifts according to the metaphysical framework. So we were talking earlier about Vedanta. So within, say, an Advaita framework, well, in a sense, nothing is real, or perhaps everything is real. And we also see this play out in concepts like Jivan Mukti, where in a framework like in an Advaita framework, there's no contradiction, because the body has the same unreal status as the Atman and so forth. Everything has is part of that same fabric, if you like. Whereas within the context of Patanjali Yoga, it becomes a little more difficult, a dualistic system, where in order to stop the turnings of the mind, the citta vritti, you have to leave aside the body. And so this kind of tension between the real and the imagined, it's not the same. It's not divided up the same way as it is in the scientific age, but it's certainly there throughout. Did you want to add anything to that? I can't remember there was something about memory and written and oral. Yes, yeah. The written, I think, takes on a much more important role, given that, in modernity, given that texts are much more available, printed texts, the reproduction of texts again is very common, and the oral tradition, in some senses, drops away. And I think we also see a revival through modern yoga institutions like Yogendra's, Sri Yogendra's Yoga Institute in Mumbai, and the Kaivalya Dham, which I've already mentioned, which institutes putting out translations and editions of yoga texts, yoga practice texts, which are then used by contemporary practitioners without without a kind of a direct connection back to those traditions necessarily, out of which these texts came. And so we have a kind of interesting interplay and tension between modern practice and textual sources, I think, being played out now in the modern yoga world, if you like. And I think I'm right in saying also that the textual tradition plays quite a different role, in fact a much more minor role in contemporary yoga practicing ascetic traditions such as the one that Jim belongs to.
Yeah, no, absolutely quite. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, within the ascetic traditions, the teachings are pretty much all passed down orally. I mean, some people will, because they're yogis and they're interested in yoga, they'll read the texts. They'll read the sort of relatively, the cheap editions you can get from bookshops all over India, but their actual practical practices that they do, they will have been taught orally by their gurus. Yeah.
One last question.
My question is connected to gender and Hatha Yoga, and considering that women they are one of the largest constituencies of present-day Hatha Yoga practitioners. The liberation texts seem to have been focusing on the liberation of men more than women, as you pointed out. So my question is, in ancient times, what was the practice of women in Hatha Yoga? And later, in modernity, in pre-modernity, women were heaped up with more and more clothing in order to make them feel ashamed about their bodies. But today, it seems as if they have deconstructed that, and they're sort of glorifying the body in doing, in coming out and unclothing themselves to do yoga, as it were. So, gender, Hatha Yoga, and liberation text. Can you connect these?
Well, I'll start, and I can hand over to Mark. But within the text, there's really, as I mentioned before, the texts are written by men for men, pretty much. And so it's very hard even to infer what women yogis or yoginis might have been doing. But we do know there are a few fleeting references where yoginis are mentioned. There's a practice that's taught in some Hatha Yoga texts in which it says, in that context, a Yogabhyasa Ratastri is mentioned, so a woman who is devoted to the practice of yoga. So we know that there were women yoginis, but really we have very little idea what they were doing. Unless, I suppose, one might surmise that they were to do pretty much all the practices also taught, for men within the text. But yeah, it's a massive gap, and even in our artistic sources, we very rarely come across, in fact, not at all, women doing yoga postures. Occasionally, we see female tapasvis doing, sort of physical austerity, such as standing up for long periods. We see that quite a bit in Mughal miniatures, in fact, and we see ashrams of female ascetics, but again, we really don't know what exactly they were doing. And I know Mark might have something to add to that historical side, but also Mark has quite nicely delineated how what the processes were by which yoga in the course of the 20th century became a practice predominantly practiced by women. Yeah.
Yes. I do think that there's an important shift when yoga starts to leave India, but also within India there's a kind of democratization of yoga within modern institutes such as Sri Yogendra's Institute, and in fact Yogendra's wife wrote the first book of yoga dedicated to women. But I think that as yoga kind of went abroad, it meshed and merged with traditions of physical practice that were developed for and by women in Europe and America particularly. There was these practices bear a closer resemblance to yoga. In fact, it's a way of using the body in order to open it to the access to the divine, to give it access to the divine. What I call in my book Yoga Body Harmonial Gymnastics. It brings one into harmony with the universe, and a lot of people were kind of turning and looking towards India and to take inspiration from India and incorporating yoga practices, breathing, rhythmic breathing as they called it, and posture into their own regimens and sort of spiritual gymnastic practices. And it seems to me that I was talking earlier about this sort of distinction that I make between Hatha Yoga and Hatha Yoga, that the latter, that Hatha Yoga, in some sense has more to do with these traditions of harmonial gymnastics than it does to do with this Hatha Yoga as this forceful practice that we were talking about earlier, that we see in those early texts. And I'm not sure about that. That's just a theory, but it could be that those starkly contrasting demographics of yoga practitioners within the Indian tradition and then within the globalized yoga tradition are because there already existed practices that looked very much like yoga and that were to some extent inspired by yoga but not completely, that were already there, and that women in particular were already practicing in large numbers by the sort of first decades of the 20th century.
One last question. I just wondered, we talked earlier on about minor texts and why you felt there was a compelling need to bring them back into focus. My question is, was this a historical coincidence that they got marginalized, or was there a dominant narrative into which they did not fit? So was the deliberation, or was the exclusion deliberate or coincidental or orchestrated? I just wondered whether there is a schema to it.
No, I don't think so. I think to some extent, well, I think so. I don't think there was any kind of conspiracy to sideline these texts. The text I've mentioned quite a few times, the Hatha Pradipika, which is a big compilation, that kind of became the go-to text for Sanskrit pundit kind of commentators writing commentaries. They would look at a couple of others, Vasishta, Samhita, but generally because that has most of the practices of Hatha Yoga in it, they would go to that. And so it's only through, and then the other texts have fallen into disuse. So this Khetri Vidya that I edited, Amrita Siddhi and so forth, there's not been any modern editions of them. There haven't been any new manuscripts for a couple of 100 years. So I don't think it's necessarily a deliberate policy of sidelining with those texts. But then again, but to look at the bigger picture about scholarship on the history of yoga, there hasn't been a great deal. I mean, I think I sort of by a quirk, Mark and I have ended up, spending the last 20 years of our lives with our careers researching the history of yoga, and we've been quite lucky that has coincided with this huge global kind of explosion of the popularity of yoga. In that, now people want to give us funding and so forth, and meanwhile. Scholarship in the past has just relied on a small handful of texts, when actually there are hundreds and hundreds of texts which are relevant. One might say a similar thing about the history of Tantra and scholarship on Tantra, and we've been very lucky in that the last 30 years or so have seen a great sort of flourishing in scholarship on Tantric texts, in which lots of them have teachings on yoga. So we've drawn on those a great deal in the text, because they haven't, they've only recently come to light. So one can't blame earlier scholars for not using them. This is, people have been going out getting manuscripts of them and producing new editions and translations. So we've used lots of them as well. But yeah, like I said, I think I touched on this before. there's sort of scholars who are prepared to do the really kind of often tedious, painstaking work of going through manuscripts and collating them and producing critical editions are generally not the sort of people who are interested in yoga. You know, they're going to be interested in grammar or philosophy and so forth. So again, I feel I've been very lucky in that this whole field is just there waiting to be explored, and no one has bothered to explore it before. And we're very lucky to be able to do this and have been able to bring together all this new stuff. Some of it's new, some of it's old, but no one's kind of brought all the different threads together. Roots, perhaps I should say.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. There are some more hands I saw, but I'm sorry I can't take them anymore because we are already beyond 8 o'clock. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you both of you. It's been a brilliant evening. We have a little token of thanks.
Small token of appreciation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. And this is our second of the Abhyas lecture series, and we plan to continue these. We have 2 things lined up. We don't have the dates fixed, but if you're not on a mailing list, please leave your names and emails outside so you'll be put to you on a mailing list, because we do hope to have these lectures and get-togethers and conversations with some regularity. So thank you all very much for being here tonight. And once again, thank you IIC for co-hosting this event tonight.